Continuing on with the topic of domain and range, we've already briefly looked at how to figure out the domain and range graphically when you're given a graph, or algebraically when you're given an equation. Now I want to look briefly at word problems and talk about special considerations when you are looking at domain and range in the context of a word problem. So here's an example of a word problem like you might have gotten when you were first learning how to do word problems with quadratics. A rectangular garden is 2 meters longer than it is wide, and it asks find a quadratic expression to express the area of the garden and state the domain of the expression. Here are our let and our then statements. Let x be the width of the garden, and if x is the width of the garden and the length is 2 meters longer, then x plus 2 is the length. And on the left-hand side, you've got an appropriate diagram, x and x plus 2 as the dimensions of the garden. So the area is going to be the length times the width, or the width times the length, so it's going to be equal to x times x plus 2, which is, if we want to expand and simplify, x squared plus 2x. So now we've answered the part about finding a quadratic expression to express the area of the garden. That's it right there. Now, you'll remember from last video and from when you studied quadratics before that parabolas, which form the graphs of quadratic equations like this, will go off to the left and the right forever. So x could be anything for this. It could be as negative or as positive as you want. But consider the question. In the question, it doesn't make sense to have a width that is 0 or negative. You can't have a negative width in this question, and it wouldn't make sense to have a 0 in either, because then you wouldn't have any area to the garden. So although if this was just stated as f of x is equal to x squared plus 2x, and there were no question behind it to give us context, x could take any value. In the context of this question, it doesn't make sense to have a value of x that's 0 or less than that. So in the context of the question, our domain is going to be, again, we start x is an element of real numbers, such that x is greater than 0. And we don't want x to be 0 either, so we leave the greater than or equals to out. We just say x is greater than 0. So that would be the domain for this in the context of the question. Essentially, we are artificially restricting the domain, artificially restricting the values x can be, so that it makes sense in the context of the question. Something to keep in mind when you're working on word problems.